I want to talk about some of your fundamental beliefs and, your advice for investors and entrepreneurs. And I know something that you're super, super passionate about, we've talked about a little bit, is just making sure, and this is specifically advice for entrepreneurs, but I'm sure part of this is for investors to hear as well too, that the relationship between entrepreneurs and investors, especially if you're investing early and you're going to be in the life of that company for a long time, is super, super, super important. Talk a little bit about that and some of your beliefs around that and why you think that's such an important thing.
I go back to my fundamental premise, this is the Greycroft view of how we approach the world, is these great companies, you need to be prepared to be in them for at least 10 years. And you want to be in them for 10 years. And so that's like a professional marriage, right? I mean, that's a decade-long relationship. It's 2.5 times longer than college, or, think about any sort of relative metric. Any relationship with a spouse, partner, friend, whatever, it's all based on respect, open communication, and enjoying being together.
Which isn't talked about enough.
Yeah, and so that's so important. And so when we meet with entrepreneurs, we explain to them some of the core tenets of our investment philosophy, which is we're going to be incredibly flexible with you as an entrepreneur, because what you go through over the next 10 years, while you have a plan and a set of projections that probably go out a couple of years or whatever, we have our own perspective on what we think your business is going to look like. None of us are going to be right. Even if it's wildly successful, it's probably not going to look anything like what we think we're investing in when we back it. And so that flexibility is crucial, because what their business will need over time could be very different than we're anticipating, even as we form that relationship. And even if I have amazing chemistry with the founder and we're just so fired up to go for 10 years, what he needs may not be Mark at some point. Now, even if we think at the time it is, and we as Greycroft need to be open to providing that company with the very best that it can get. And we've had companies in our portfolio where certain of our partners end up having better expertise over time in an industry or whatever in a company. And we'll work with the company to kind of switch our own roles if that's better for the company, if that's what the company wants. We don't force them to do that. And so we want to be flexible. And so trying to think through the number of twists and turns that the relationship could take up front is really important. So we spend a lot of time in our courtship and dating process with entrepreneurs, and sometimes it's very fast, right? Because the deal's very hot. The time pressure is really high, but we still try to slow down and make sure that they're calling references on us. Obviously, we want to call references on them. We want to spend time understanding what's your company culture? How does that relate not only to your employees, to your customers, but to your board and to your investors? Like, ideally, it's a consistent philosophy, right? But how do you think about that? And we want to bring on our side that flexibility, but also a commitment that, hey, we're going to go through some tricky and probably some hard decisions at some point, even if it's all good, right? And the company's generally winning. There's still hard decisions to make. And we always want them to feel like you can be direct. We're always going to try to have empathy and compassion, but we're going to be direct with you, right? And give you our perspective. You don't always have to listen to it, but we're going to be honest with you. And we hope you'll do the same with us. And we hope over time that we'll be the first, if not the first, one of the first calls they'll make on the great news and the really tough stuff that's happening that they wish they didn't have to call somebody to talk to about. And we want to be that call, and we want them to know that we're going to be honest and open and compassionate and listen to it, and that at the end of the day, we're going to put the company's interests in front of ours, and we hope that the founders, they'll do the same. They'll put the company's interest in front of even their own interest, if that's what's best for the company in the long run. If both parties are willing to do that, it all ends up working out. It's a little bit hard to do because there's a lot of ego involved on both sides, but it really is cathartic when you build those relationships that have that underpinning of trust, like every good relationship you have has.
Yeah, and to try to maybe draw out some of those things to kind of reiterate them. So it sounds like a part of your process is clearly over-indexing on spending a lot of time up front with entrepreneurs, just getting on the same page, forming that relationship that's going to be the basis of, how you're going to work together over the next 10 years. Then it's about open but direct communication. It's about sharing of good news and bad news. Anything else to add to that list, or is that kind of the big ones?
It's a commitment to them. One of the things that comes up a lot of times in companies is that there's depending on big outcomes like an exit or a big fundraise or something, there's typically like a board vote and a shareholder vote. And they're different, right? On the board, everybody, including the investors, have a fiduciary responsibility to all of the shareholders, as do the founders or the CEO or whoever, depending on if the founders are still running the company at that time. They also have a fiduciary responsibility to everybody, both as operators of the business as well as directors. On the shareholder vote, anybody can vote their shares in whatever interest they have. But the board vote, to me, is the important one, because what we want to try to do is always think like, how do we make the pie the biggest? How do we help the company the most? How do we build the biggest, most enduring business and optimize it for the super long game? And most founders also are thinking the same way, and they know, because they've been hiring people all along and building an option pool and taking dilution to bring on other people. So they fundamentally understand the relationship. But when you kind of keep thinking, what's best for the company, both for the investor and the founders, it just has kind of a magical moment where the culture of the business is around optimization of the pie. And I think that's where the best outcomes come. There's hardly ever a split vote on the board. It just doesn't happen very often, except for very corner casey kind of things. And that's generally because the founders build a culture, they execute, and they're open about the challenges, and they build consensus kind of before any sort of like complicated vote comes up in the first place. And that's what everybody wants.